Hello friends, Jermaine here and welcome to this course. We're going to be building a recipe management app with Hasura and Flutter. This is what the app looks like. We've got our initial screen here where no recipes have been added. Let's go ahead and add our first recipe. Our recipe will take in a name, a description, an image URL, and we'll add some ingredients. And then we'll go ahead and add our recipe. Adding a recipe now displays it here as such. We can view the full details of this recipe by clicking on it, which brings up this panel. And then clicking go back brings us back to the screen. If we wish to remove a recipe, we just need to slide it over to the left, which reveals this delete action button. When I click on that, then I get this alert dialog. And when I hit delete, it goes ahead and removes it. And then we're back to the screen. And if we already have a recipe added, we can go ahead and click this plus button at the top right, which will bring us to this add recipe screen. All right, without further ado, let's get started. Before we get to writing code, it would be a good idea to go over our database model. It's a simple one. We're going to be working with two tables, recipes and ingredients. A recipe will have these fields, name, description, image, URL, ID. And an ingredient will have an ID and a name, and also will have a foreign key called a recipe ID, which will point to the particular recipe that ingredient belongs to. We will come to our Hasura dashboard. And if you want to know more about how to get this set up, look at the video that I made on Hasura. We'll create a table. We'll call this table name recipes. And then the column names will have an ID. The column type will be an integer, auto-incrementing. We'll have a name column. This will be of type text. We'll have a description, which will also be of type text. And we'll make this nullable. And then we'll have our image URL column, which is also of type text. And we can also make that nullable. The primary key in this table will be our ID column. And then everything else should pretty much remain the same. And then we'll click add table. So now that we've got our recipes table added, we're going to go ahead and add a table for our ingredients. The columns will be an ID, which is an integer, auto-incrementing. We'll have a name, which will be of type text. And then we'll have our recipe ID foreign key, which will be an integer. The primary key of this table will be the ID field. And then under this foreign keys heading, we'll click add a foreign key. We'll set recipes as our reference table, and then we want the recipe ID to join to the ID column in our recipes table. And on delete violation, we want to cascade, which means that when we delete a recipe, we also want to delete the ingredients connected to that recipe. So I'll click save, and then I'll go ahead and click add table. And after that is done, I'm gonna come over here, and we want to make sure that we are tracking our foreign key relationships in order to expose them over our GraphQL API. So I'll just click track all. And then that should be good. So after all of that, we can come to GraphQL or graphical. If we look at our docs, we get these queries and mutations and subscriptions generated for us. We got queries for ingredients and for recipes, and you find the same under mutations. I covered all of this in the Hasura 101 video, so go and take a look at that. Let's now go to the code base. I have two different projects set up. So one is a Flutter app generated by doing Flutter create, and this one is a simple console application also that's been generated. This is available on the starter branch if you go to the GitHub URL for this project, which is in the description below. Just to briefly talk about the packages we're using. So in the GraphQL client project, we're using the Ferry package, including the dependencies Ferry needs. To learn more about Ferry, take a look at the Dart package of the week video. In the Flutter app, I also have the Ferry package added, and I've got Ferry Flutter working with the GraphQL client. I've added the GetIt package, so it will allow us to access our client object in a way that it's decoupled from our UI. I've got Flutter Slidable, which is what gives us the slidable list item effect with the delete button behind it. I'm also importing our GraphQL client, and I've got the UUID package for generating unique strings. So I'm gonna go ahead and open these two packages in separate projects. So I'll open this one, and then I've gone ahead and opened the Flutter project separately. So for now, we're gonna be working on our Flutter project, so I'll just minimize that. So this main file has the basic material app, so I'll delete all of that. So what we want here is, rather than creating a material app, we'll go ahead and import the Cupertino library, and then we want to create a Cupertino app. And we'll go ahead and define some routes. So we'll create the routes named argument, and which takes in a map object. So we'll define two routes. One is the route, and for this route route, we're gonna return a text widget for now, and then we'll create another route called new, which is for creating a new recipe. We'll define the initial route we want to be loaded to be the first one, the /. So now let's go ahead and run our Flutter app. Okay, so we got our app actually running, and the reason why we don't see anything, because CupertinoApp takes a scaffold widget. For now, I'm going to go ahead and hide the debug mode banner. And let's go ahead and create our first screen. So under lib, I'll create a source folder and a screens directory. And then in there, let's add our new file. So our first file will be AllRecipes.dart. And in here, we'll import our Cupertino library. We'll create a stateless widget, which we will call AllRecipesScreen. The build function will return a Cupertino page scaffold. And then for the child of that, let's just set a text saying all recipes. And then let's go ahead and import this over here. And then we'll use that here. Still get nothing. Let's restart the app. So now we get this white screen because of the scaffold, and we see the recipes text. So let's develop this a bit more. We're going to be rendering a custom scroll view. This custom scroll view takes in slivers. A sliver represents a portion of a scrollable area. So the first sliver we're gonna have is a Cupertino sliver navigation bar. And within this navigation bar, we'll define a large title, which will be a text widget that says all recipes. So that looks like that. We'll define a trailing widget, and this widget will be a Cupertino button. This button will have an onPressed event. When we press that button, we want to navigate to the other screen. So we'll do navigator.push named, and the name of our route we called new. And the child of our Cupertino button will be an icon widget. The icon we'll specify is from our Cupertino icon set, and we want the plus rectangle fill. And let's make it slightly bigger. Okay, and I'm just gonna increase the padding a little bit. So we'll do an edge inserts all, and then we'll give a padding of 5. Yeah, which puts it at the top right. So if I go ahead and I click that, then we get this new screen. Of course, I'm not able to go back because we've not defined the scaffolding for the screen. So for now, I'll just restart the app. Let's go ahead and create our new recipe screen. So under screens, I'll create a new file called new recipe. I'll import Cupertino. Let's create another stateless widget, and we'll call it new recipe screen. The child will be a Cupertino page scaffold as well, which also takes in a custom scroll view. And let's go ahead and load this in. And over here, I'll pass that in here, like so. So when we click that, we should now have this screen. Let's go ahead and add a navigation bar on the screen. So we'll have a navigation bar, and we'll define the middle widget which will be a text widget that says add recipe. So this should now look like that, and then back button brings us back. So since our recipes are going to be rendered in a scrollable list, we need to define a sliver list widget, and this sliver list takes in a delegate, which the type of delegate we want is a sliver child list delegate. This will take in a list of child widgets that it will be rendering in our sliver list. So for now, let's just have a for loop. And this for loop is gonna just render 100 text widgets. So it should look something like that. I'm gonna comment this out for now. And what we want to do is to render the initial view where we have no recipes added yet. So I'm gonna create a new folder under source, and then I'll call it widgets. And then the widget we're gonna create is called NoRecipes. And we'll go ahead and import Cupertino and material libraries. We'll create a stateless widget. We'll call it NoRecipes. We are going to render a column. The children of our column will consist of an icon. And then in particular, we want an icon from our Cupertino icon set. We're going to go with the square, stack, 3D, down right. And let's import this in here. And then over here, let's render it like so. Okay, so we got that blue icon there. Let's give it a color. And then I'm gonna go for black 12. And let's make the size bigger. I'm gonna add a text widget below that, just saying no recipes to view. Okay, let's style this text. And we'll just set the color to gray. And then after that, we'll render our Cupertino button. On pressing that button, we'll navigate to the new screen, which is because the child of this Cupertino button will be a text widget that says add your first. So that should look like that. And when I click on that, it brings us to adding our first recipe. Let's add some spacing because it looks cluttered currently. So before the icon, I'll add a sized box. I'll give it a height of 100. And between the icon and text widgets, I'll add another sized box and give it a height of 10. Okay, so that should look like that. That's all we need to do with this widget. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. Let's go ahead and define what each recipe would look like. So under our widgets, I'll create a new file. I'll call it RecipeListTile. In here, I'll import the Cupertino and material libraries because we're going to be using it in a stateless widget. We'll call this widget RecipeListTile. The child of this container will be a row widget. And then for our children of that row, we'll have a container. And for now, let's just give it a height, a width also of 90. And then we'll set the color to colors.blue-gray. And then I'll save this. And let's go ahead and import this into our AllRecipes. And just make sure I spell it correctly. Okay. So let me go ahead and render this here. RecipeListTile. Alright, so that looks like that. We'll give this a box decoration, which means we need to move this color in there. Let's give it a border radius of 10. And then we'll also give it an image which would be a decoration image. This decoration image takes in an image provider. We'll specify a network image. Then we'll use a placeholder instead. So I'll pull an image from placeholder.it, like so. And also if for some reason the image we're loading doesn't fit the whole shape of the container, you can go ahead and set this option as well. So fit, we'll do box fit dot cover. The second child of our row will be an expanded widget, because we want this widget to take the remaining width in the row. So we'll give this a child, which will be a column widget. For our first child, we'll have a text widget containing the recipe name. So we'll just say recipe 1, and I'll save that. Okay, let's shift it to the left by setting the main axis alignment. And then we'll set the cross-axis alignment to start as well. So let's add some styling for this text widget. We'll give it a color, which will be black 87, so almost opaque. And we'll give it a bold font weight. And then next we need to specify a text description. So for now I'm going to go ahead and copy in some lorem ipsum text. Okay, so it's a lot of text. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, that looks like that. We'll set the maximum amount of lines we need to 2, like so, and then we will set the overflow to show the ellipsis. Okay, let's give this some styling, and we want to set the color to blue-gray. All right. So now that we've got an idea of where the data we pull in from our database will be piped into, between the text and the description, I'll have a sized box to add some spacing. And then I'll copy this one here as well, but then I'll set a width of 15. So it's spaced out a bit here too. And since this whole list style is going to be clickable, we are going to wrap all of this in a Cupertino button instead of a container. And I'll just define the onPressed function here. Okay, so that should now look like that. So all of that should be clickable now. So therefore, when we press this, what we want to do is to display the modal pop-up. So we can just do show Cupertino modal pop-up. This will take in the current build context, and also it takes in a builder function, which will be the widget we want to render. So that also has the build context. And then for now, we will have a container. The color of this container will be white, and then the child just be a text widget saying RecipeDetail. Okay, so let's save that, and once we test this out, we get RecipeDetail at the bottom here. And once we click in this area, the container collapses and we're back to this screen. So I'm going to leave that bit for now because we're going to be developing that later on. What we're going to do next is to display the thin line that appears beneath each recipe. I'll go ahead and have this Cupertino button displayed in a column widget, and then the second child of our column widget will have a container widget with a height set to 1, and then the color of that will be gray and with a 200 shade. So it should be just thin enough to be visible. Alright, so at this point it would be a good idea to switch gears a little bit and work on our GraphQL client so that we can pull in data from our database and display it instead of this dummy data we're seeing here. I'm going to switch over to the GraphQL client. What we're going to do first is to pull in the schema definition from our database. So to do that, I'm just going to use a tool called GetGraphQL Schema. I've got a link in the description. And we'll specify the URL to our GraphQL server, which is localhost 8081 v1/GraphQL. And we can confirm that by coming over here, and it says GraphQL endpoint, and this is the endpoint over here. So that's what I got here. And what we'll do is we'll pipe the results of that into lib source schema.graphql. Let me run that. And then in our lib directory source, oh wait, it was meant to go in GraphQL. Never mind, let's just drag this in here. And then in here is the generated schema. And what we can do is we can also go ahead and generate the relevant Dart files based on this schema. So the configuration for that is in this build.yaml file. Again, take a look at the Dart package of the week video on Ferry. I explain all of this. Let's go ahead and do pub run build runner build. And if we look closely, we should see some Dart files appear here. Okay, so there we have it. And I'm gonna go ahead and delete this git keep file. So now that we got the relevant Dart classes generated for our schemas, let's also go ahead and define the operations we're gonna be performing on our GraphQL endpoint. So I'll create a new file under libsource GraphQL. I'll call it operations.graphql. And in fact, before we go ahead defining an operation, let's come back to our database and let's add some data. So I'll go ahead and create a new recipe under insert row. And the first recipe we're going to insert is one called Easy Turkey Crown. And I'll copy in the description, and I'll copy in the image URL. And then I'll save this. So now when we go to browse rows, we've got our first entry added here. And let's go ahead and add some ingredients. So I'll insert row, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this in. The recipe ID is going to be 1. So I'll save that. And let's go ahead and add a couple more ingredients. Okay, so if we now come to browse rows, then we've got these ingredients added or linked to our first recipe. So if we come under recipes, the ID is correct, and also we can view the ingredients here like so to retrieve our recipes. So I'll come down here and I'll get rid of all of that. We'll have our first query. I'll call it fetch recipe list. Query will invoke the recipes operation. And then for each of the recipe, we want the ID, we want the name, we want the image URL. Oh, we also want the description. And then we'll get the type name. So if I go ahead and execute this query, then we get this result back. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'll paste it in here as my operation and save this. And instead of build, I'll do pub run build runner watch. So that should automatically run the build every time we save a file. So in order to use the generated files, I'm going to come to RM GraphQL client, and in here I'm going to import the Ferry package, and I'll also import GraphQL HTTP link. And let's also export some of the files that we've generated, because we're going to be using those in the Flutter app. So our export operations, the data file, the variable file, and also our export the schema that we generated. And in order to use our GraphQL client, we need to initiate a client object that we'll be using to make our requests. So we'll create a function called init client, which returns a client type. This will take in a URI string, so the endpoint we're trying to hit. Let's create a link object, which takes in the URI we passed in. And then we'll create a client variable which will instantiate our GraphQL client, and that takes in that link we created. And for now we'll just return client like so. Let's come back to our Flutter app and use this client. And then in here I'll go ahead and import the GetIt package. And we're doing that because we are going to use that to register our client objects that will be passing around the app. So like I said earlier on, it uses the service locator pattern. So we do getIt.instance.register singleton. Type is client. We need to import our GraphQL client library, and then we'll invoke init client, and we'll specify the URL, and let's import ferry. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and restart the app so that we can access our client instance. So from here I'll come back to all recipes, and then I'll import the GetIt package. I'll also import our GraphQL client, and from our imports we'll create our recipes request like so. I'll get rid of this const keyword, and then over in here in our sliver childless delegate I'll get rid of this for loop. We don't need it anymore. And we also need to import the ferry and ferry flutter libraries, which is because we're going to be using the operation widget, which is from ferry flutter. For our operation request, we'll pass in recipes request, and for our client, because we're using the GetIt package, we can do getIt.instance, and then we'll specify the client type. Let's define our builder function, which gives us a context and then a response from our API, and the type of response is operation response. Specifically it's G fetch recipe list data and recipe list vars. So firstly we need to check if it's loading, then we can return a loading spinner. Or else we can return our data from the database. So for now let's just do text, and then we'll do response.data.to.json and also .to string. Okay, let's take a look at that. Okay, so we got something now. So provided we have a response, I'll create a variable, and then I'll assign response.data.recipes to it. We are going to have two more checks. So we'll say if our recipes are empty, then we want to return this NoRecipes widget that we created, or else we'll just show that. And then what we want to render instead of this is a column widget. For the children of this column, we'll use a loop for each item in our database. This is a standard for loop. So we'll say for var index equals 0, as long as index is less than the recipe's length. Then we'll have our increment at the end. We are going to render our recipe list tile widget. And I'll get rid of this stuff. Okay, that looks good. And let's go ahead and pass in the data into our recipe list style. So I'll come to our list style widget. I'll define the recipe that we're going to be passing in. So the type is going to be in the GraphQL package that we created. So I'll come up here and I'll copy. In fact, I'll copy all of that. Okay, so we want g fetch recipe list data underscore recipes, and then we'll call this field recipe. For our recipe list style, we also need to define and pass this in here. So we'll do this the recipe, and let's also mark this as required, which is helpful for IntelliSense. Because of this required annotation, when we come over here to our all recipes listing, we see that that's highlighted yellow, and then it tells us the parameter recipe is required. So let's go ahead and pass our recipe in, which will be recipes and the current index. Okay, so now that we've got our recipe, we can go ahead and pass that in here. So recipe image URL, for instance, like so. And because the image URL was defined as nullable in the database, I'm gonna do this instead. So we do recipe.image URL, or else we'll use this placeholder. Okay, and let's output the recipe name. All right, and then the recipe description. Okay, so that now looks like that. Let's go ahead and look at the recipe detail view, so that when we click on that, we should see the recipe details showing up. I'll create another widget. Under widgets, I'll call it recipe detail view. I'll pull in the same imports that I have here. I'll define another stateless widget. We'll call it recipe detail, and this will take in the recipe option. So we're going to pass the recipe in here, and let's define a required field for the recipe. For the child, we'll keep the container, but then we'll, for now, render the recipe's name. And let's save this and import it in here. And then in our recipe list tile, where we show the Cupertino modal popup for our builder function, we'll return the recipe detail, and then also we'll pass in the recipe. So let's check this out now. Okay. So we've got the recipe passed in, and we see the name here, Easy Turkey Crown. So let's style this a bit so it looks better than it already does. I'll wrap this container in another widget. So this will be a Cupertino page scaffold. We'll give this container a height, and the height will be 90% of the screen. So we'll do media query .of our current build context, and we do .size .height, and if I save this now, it will cover the whole screen, but then we want 90% of it, so we'll multiply it by 0.9. Okay, so that gives us that. I'll set the width of the container to full width. Let's give this container some padding. And I'm going to add it on the horizontal axis, so symmetric. So horizontally, we'll give it a padding of 20. Let's decorate our container by setting the decoration named argument, and we want a box decoration. And just so we can see it properly, we'll set the background color of our Cupertino page scaffold to transparent, which is because we're gonna give this container a color of white, and then we'll give it a border radius. For this case, we want a border radius that only covers the top left. So we'll do radius.circular like so, and then the top right. For the child of this container, we'll have a custom scroll view here as well with a list of slivers. And then we want a sliver list, which takes in a delegate, and we want a sliver child list delegate, which takes in a list of widgets to render. So for our use case, we just want to render a column widget, and then the children of this column will consist of our text. So let's see what that looks like. Yeah, still looks like that. I'll adjust the cross-axis alignment so we can have it to the left, like so. Let's go ahead and style our text. And we'll style this based on the Cupertino theme. So we'll do Cupertino theme dot of our current build context, and then we want the text theme, and in our text theme we want the nav large title text style. I'll add some spacing at the top, add some spacing below the title, and I'll just make it 20. We'll render a container which will display our image. So this will be a network image, and then the source will be our image URL. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, let's adjust the fitting of our image by doing fit. We'll say box fit dot fit width, and we don't see that effect because we need to specify container width. So I'll say width, then we'll make it full width. Okay, so that now looks like that. Let's give it a decoration. So we'll say box decoration. We'll set the border radius to circular. We'll set it to 20. Okay, currently we don't see the border radius because we need to clip the image. So we'll set a clip behavior on the container, and then we'll do clip.anti-alias. Okay, so now it's clipped at the edges. We'll add a space beneath this container, and then we'll render our description. Let's make the text slightly bigger. Okay, and then let's render the ingredients text here. We'll add some spacing like so, and we'll also give it a style, and we'll base this off the Cupertino theme. We want the text theme, we want the nav title text style, and in fact let's just amend the font size of that. So we'll do copy width, and we'll set the font size equal 25, and I made a mistake, my bad. Let's delete that. Yeah, it should look like that. Okay. We have not defined our operation to retrieve ingredients yet. So for now, let's just have our button telling the user to go back. So we do Cupertino button, and then on pressed, we'll do navigator dot pop. We'll give this button a color. And then the child will be a text widget saying go back. Okay, so if we try this now, we click go back, then it brings us here. And also we can click here, which brings us back. All right, let's center this button by wrapping it within a center widget, like so, and I'll add some spacing. Let's make it 40 between that and the ingredients title. For now, I'll have a circular progress indicator here because we need to load ingredients in. All right, let's take a look at how we can load in our ingredients. I'm gonna come to our dashboard and I'll create another query. This query will be called fetch recipe ingredients, which will be based on this operation here. This will take in a query variable called where, and we'll have an ingredients Boolean expression. When we fetch our recipe ingredients, we need to pass the recipe ID so that it will get the correct ingredients. And over here, I'll set where like so. Ingredients only has an ID and name. Let's also retrieve the recipe ID. And then in our query variables, we want where the recipe ID is equal to 1. And then when we run this, it should give us that. So I'll copy this one. And then let's paste that in our GraphQL client. Now go ahead and save this file. We should rerun the build. We'll come back to our Flutter project. Let's define our recipe ingredients request. So over here, I'll do final gfetch recipe ingredients request. And then we'll call the field ingredients rec. And what you find is that sometimes the Dart Analyser doesn't recognize that we generated this new class because it's been done in a separate project. In order for the analyzer to pick this up, we can go back, we can go to this library, and then we can go to our operations file. And when we come here, hopefully our analyzer should now pick it up. Okay. All right, so next, in order to initialize our ingredients request object, we can't do it here because we need access to our recipe details, in particular the recipe ID. So after our constructor initializer, we are going to initialize it here. And then we'll create this object, and I'll just have a comma afterwards because we still need this bit. And we need to get rid of this const keyword. Okay. So in this object, we can specify a function where we'll define our request variable. So here we want to define where the recipe ID is equal to recipe.id. So something like that. So all of this is based on what we did over here. So let's use our ingredients request by coming down over here, cutting this out, and then we'll have our operation widget. Our client will be our GetIt instance. Specify a builder function. And let's also specify the operation request, which is our ingredients rec. And then for now, let's just return the circular progress indicator. Okay, and let's set the correct type for the response, because at the moment it's dynamic. And the type consists of that. For this to be recognized, we need to go over here, and then it's our data file. So there, yeah, we should sort this one out. And then if we go into var, we see that here. Yeah, that should get rid of the error. Let's have a if check. Then we return our circular progress indicator. And let's wrap this in a center widget. Or else we are going to return a column which will render out our ingredients. And the children of that column will have a for loop. So we'll say for var ingredients in response.data.ingredients. Then we want to render a text widget containing the ingredient name. And let's save that. Okay. And this gives us an empty result. Nothing appears to be showing up. So let's just print response.data.ingredients, and let's see what that gives us. Okay, so it's giving us an empty object. And in fact, I did some digging on this, and this is caused by an issue with a package that Ferry relies on. So this is the built value package. I believe there's a GitHub issue out there for it, but for now, what we can do, and this is related to the way built value handles list items that are nullable. We'll come back here, we'll go into our schema.graphql, and then what we want to do is to search for in and in. So we'll comment these two out as a current workaround for this issue related to built value, and I'll save this. So after that, we should be able to return to this file, and let's do a restart, and let's launch this. Okay, so there we go. We got our ingredients displayed here now. Okay, we'll set the cross-axis alignment of our column to start. And let's add some spacing between each of the ingredients because they're too close together. We'll wrap this text widget in a list item, and then we want to spread the items in this children list. And the reason why we're doing that is so that we can also render a sized box with every list item with a height set to 10. Which means we get some spacing now. We also need some spacing between the ingredients and the list. So I'll copy this here and I'll make this 15. I'll add some spacing at the very bottom by copying this over here. And let's save that. So that should scroll like that. Okay. So this now looks like this, and when I click go back, it brings me here. The last feature I want us to add before we finish this video is the slidable list item that reveals the delete button. So to do that, I'm gonna close this and I'll come back to RecipeListTile. I'll import the Flutter slidable package, and then what I'm gonna do is wrap this column in the slidable widget. So I'll wrap this column with widget, and then on the slidable widget, and we need to define an action pane for the slidable widget. So it's a slidable drawer action pane, and we need to define a secondary action. So this is the button that appears behind the slidable, and here we want an icon slide action. The caption will be delete. The icon will be from our Cupertino icon set, and then we want the pencil icon. So right now if I go here, I should be able to slide it like so, and we see the delete icon action. Let's set the color, and then we can define an on-tap function. So when we tap the delete button, what we want is to display a dialog. So we'll say show Cupertino dialog. This takes in the current build context and also a builder function. And what we want to do is to return a Cupertino alert dialog. So if we click on delete, at the moment it looks like that. And then in our dialog, if we specify the title, which will be delete, followed by 2 double quotes, which will contain the recipe name. At the moment, we're not going to see anything because we need to open it again. So let's restart the app and let's open this again. Okay, so we get that, and we're not able to dismiss it yet. So let's define a list of actions. We'll render a Cupertino dialog action. The child of that will be a text widget that says cancel. And then when we select that action, or select that button, or press that action button, we'll pop our current navigation context. Then we'll go ahead and restart. So if we click on delete, then this comes up, and when I click cancel, then it brings us back here. Okay, so let's go ahead and duplicate this, and the next one will be delete, and let's see what that looks like. So when I hit delete, then we get that, and then when I click that, of course nothing happens because we're just popping the current navigator. But essentially what we'll do on hitting delete, we will invoke a method called remove recipe over here, which will go ahead and perform the operation to delete the recipe. And then once we've successfully deleted that recipe, then we can do navigator.of context.pop. And of course we need to pass in the current build context at least, and also we'll pass in a recipe ID. So that means we can come over here and then invoke remove recipe. We'll pass in the current build context, and then we'll pass in the recipe ID like so. So when we go ahead and we delete, then it'll perform the operation, and then we should see this disappear. So I am going to end the video here. We've covered quite a lot of ground. We are retrieving recipes from our database and displaying it here in this list, and also we can view details of a recipe when we click on it. And we've also got this delete dialog showing up, as well as this empty add recipe page. So in the next part of this course, we'll go ahead and build the rest of our flow, and we'll also look at how to make cache updates as well, because that's a thing with GraphQL. And I'm going to end the video here. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, smash the like button. If you're not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon so you don't miss out on the next update. If you've got any questions or feedback you wish to make, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.